Awesome. So welcome
Fantastic.
everyone. Oh, sorry. Welcome to Metagov seminar. We're very excited today to have Oliver Klingefjord here to present on
Klingefjord,
the
yeah.
Meaning Alignment Institute and his work on the AGI Institutions Grid. So welcome, Oliver, and I'll pass it to you.
All right, thank you so much. Happy to be here. I'm gonna share my screen, see if this works. Uh, this side. All right, can you see this presentation now? Perfect. Hello, everyone. So my name is Oliver. I'm the co-founder of a thing called the Meaning Alignment Institute, and that's an institute with three of us. We research essentially how to align AI and institutions around what people value. And this talk will kind of spell out a little bit what I mean by that. So traditionally, alignment was sort of this field around like how can we make one AI model behave in accordance with what we want, essentially. And I think there's been kind of a shift within even the field of alignment itself, where it's gone away from that and more towards this idea of like how can we align a society of AIs and humans sort of interacting with each other, or make sure that a society with AI and humans lead to overall good outcomes. And this is because of several reasons. Partly, we have a million or several million, I don't know how many, of these multiple agents running around doing things. Some of them have bank accounts, they're transacting, and that's a very rich opportunity for sort of emergent misalignment failures because they work very differently. There are a lot of different kinds of societal harms that can come from sort of rich interactions that are not predictable from just what the model is. And of course, these models could be aligned to individual users with their own goals, etc. So the alignment problem is essentially richer than just this classic view. And even if you solve this sort of singleton problem, there is still this thing where in our institutions, there are incentives to build unaligned AGIs. Companies would benefit from having AIs aligned with certain sort of short-term company goals that don't quite um, um, that aren't quite as pro-social as we would like. And so there is a sort of the AI companies kind of exist within an institutional sort of scaffolding, which is quote unquote misaligned. And this point has been made by many people, starting from Drexler in 2019, and now there's a lot of work on this coming out from Google DeepMind that is making this point. And so, how do humans align in society? Well, we have a kind of a word for that. It's called institutions, and it's essentially the rules, norms, and mechanisms that structure how people interact and make choices and trade-offs with each other. So you can think of that as this sort of coordination infrastructure that sits between individual choices and collective outcomes. And we think it's quite helpful to sort of map them out in this way that we do here, where you can think of various institutions as being on different scales. Some institutions are between two parties or bilateral. Some institutions are for groups like teams or clubs or companies. And then you have, institutions that are made for cities or bigger organizations. Some are made for an entire country or some are global. And you can also split the kinds of institutions we use to coordinate as humans based on the information basis you need or how much you need to know about the other party. So in this example here, you have to the very left protocols and preferences and stuff like that, where the information base is pretty small. You don't need to know that much about the other party to perform a handshake protocol. And if you go more towards the right, we have things like legal sort of courts and stuff like that, where there is some sort of more values-based, like thick process where it's not just we're not dealing with shallow preferences, but some sort of spirit of the law thing, and we have a judge actually try to interpret what's going on in a very like time-consuming way, but a very sort of thick way. It's the word we would use. Um, and we need to do better for this world of agents and AI. Why exactly? Well, so many of these institutions that I just showed you, they assume certain things about the participants. Sorry. Um, they assume that humans are slow, we have limited bandwidth, we can be put in jail, and we're sort of quote unquote mediocre at optimization versus like we have values and norms and all this stuff, which sort of prevents certain kind of bad outcomes that could occur if we were to just follow the incentives of the institutions we operate in. And so an example is sort of of how this could break down is that you can have AI agents that can sort of outpace the law, for instance, find loopholes in the law. You could have AI agents that try to sort of good hard certain incentives or agents that just breaks a bunch of sort of existing institutions like courts and certain kinds of markets. Um, so I guess the question we pose with this grid is like, well, there's also this opportunity, right? Where like, could we make new mechanisms or institutions that make good outcomes the natural equilibria, where the sort of good things we want out of society and AGI becomes the natural things that occur. And so we have a separate version of this grid, which is what we're currently calling the AGI Institutions Grid, where for each of these boxes, there is some sort of version of it that's kind of AGI, AI agent first, that will sort of stand against some of these problems. They're not all filled out. We're still working on this. And many of these are sort of like early ideas. They're not something we have a lot of research on. But this is kind of just our way of giving a sort of an overview of like what we think needs to happen in society for AGI overall to go well. And to give some examples of what these things are, in the sort of like top right corner, we have things around how agents could sort of exchange vows or sort of commitments in a rich way together in order to cooperate well. On the left, you have ways agents could negotiate and bargain. There are certain kinds of adjudication processes and AI judges that can operate at high enough speed such that regulation can keep pace with AI. And that's just to name a few. But the good news here is that LLMs open up a new sort of frontier for institutional design where the old constraints that our institutions were designed around, they don't hold. But with LLM, we have an opportunity to do a lot of new cool stuff in how we design these institutions. And I'll give you two examples to make this concrete of things that we're working on. The first is a thing called market intermediaries. And this is a way to think about markets where we try to better track them to what people actually want. And so in general, I think markets work really well when we're dealing with commodities, when we're dealing with technology or services and these kind of stuff where the sort of implicit contract that we're trading over is very tightly coupled to what we actually want. So if I buy a MacBook, for instance, I want certain kinds of processor speeds and battery life and this kind of stuff that basically unlocks the sort of use case I want, which is like I wanted to do software engineering well or something like that. But for more sort of experience goods, outcome-based stuff, it's a little harder. Like I might want a certain kind of connection out of a social media app or a certain kind of serendipity out of a festival or something like that. But I'm essentially contracting around access, like I'm buying a ticket or I'm buying access to this service. And so there's this big skew in these fields where about what we actually want and sort of what we're buying and contracting over. I think that skew will continue to grow and become a problem. But at the same time, LLMs sort of allow us to do pretty nifty stuff, like being able to understand in depth what people actually want out of a thing through some kind of interview, for instance, and then specify that in a contract in rich enough language that it could be validated afterwards, whether it occurred or not, and also adjudicated if it did not occur. So that's one sort of intervention in the sort of market space. In terms of, and maybe this is more relevant for this community, like the sort of decision making, I think there's a lot of very rich kind of coordination infrastructure you can build around how to think about value trade-offs and things like that. For instance, we built this thing with OpenAI called moral graph elicitation, which is a sort of deliberative mechanism where people are interviewed with a chatbot about what's important to them and what's meaningful to them in certain situations, and then it drills down into the underlying concerns. And you get this thing called a values card, which is the way we think about values, where we distinguish them from other things many other people call values, like preferences, but also norms, also things like slogans or ideological commitments, but essentially something that's meaningful to people, some way of life that's intrinsically meaningful to people. And then in the second step, there is a process where we're comparing pairs of these, and we generate a story of someone moving from one to the other, and we ask people if they thought this person became wiser. And the outcome of this is a thing we call a moral graph, which is a sort of a data object that specs out the wisest way of approaching certain situations according to a population where they all kind of agree that it is the wisest way. And by doing this process, it also surfaces expertise in a way where we don't have to pre-select any experts, but people recognize what's important as they go along. So that's sort of one deliberative mechanism. I think also combining that with some sort of representative mechanism like Habermalt opens up like a really interesting space of imagining a kind of continuous values-based deliberative mechanism that could actually keep a pace with law and things like that. So that's essentially it for this short little intro presentation. I'll stop sharing my, actually, I won't stop sharing my screen here. I'll close this and I'll also go to this webpage, agi-institution.org, just to show you that this is something we're kind of in the process of filling out. You have this existing human institutions grid that I showed you, but then there's this AGI one. And we think essentially that this will be kind of a joint project. Like obviously this is not something we as an organization can handle alone. And so our role here is to sort of I guess seed the research that we want to happen. We have a research network that we're doing this with. And you can also click into these, and you might notice some of them have this little green flag, which means that we have thought a little bit about how to sort of like think about this and get started. And so some of them have this thing we call problem sets, where for negotiation and bargaining, this is kind of a one way to start thinking about this problem. And then they're meant to be something you can kind of start on and make a little bit of progress just to get a feel for like what is the shape of this problem. And all of this is also on GitHub. And so if you have sort of like more references or ideas, you can make contribution to it or suggest other ways in which it could be extended. Um, yeah. Maybe I'll stop there and I guess take questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Oliver. Uh, Curious. I think Habermalt, Steve, right? Habermolt. Um,
Habermalt, Steve.
yeah. Atman, question?
Yeah, quick question. Really cool presentation. I do a lot of work around like institutions and whatnot, so this is like super exciting. I have like two questions. One might be nitpicky, but also it's just kind of just to understand where you guys are going with this. You were mentioning like the AGI institutions, and you were like AGI agents first, like AI agents first and whatnot. For that like that board you were building. And
Mhm.
I was wondering, within the previous, like the previous board you were showing with like, just regular institutions that we have today,
Mhm.
is it separate? Like, are those considered to have like AI implemented within those regular institutions, or AG, AI agent institutions first? That's like, yes, there's AI in there, but also AI agents first. Like, where's the, I don't know if
Yeah,
that's
sorry. I guess I was a little sloppy with the AI agents first. I guess I just mean some modification of that kind of institution that actually works in a world with AI agents.
okay.
So it's not necessarily the case that they have to all be sort of like thought as built up by AI agents. I don't think that's the case, but they have to sort of somehow work in a world where there is where we're in a society with humans and AI agents or humans and many AIs interacting in very complex ways. Many of them do have sort of agents in the name, or they're somehow building on some kind of agent idea. But yeah, the criterion for that grid, the AGI institutions grid, is just that they work in
Okay.
quote unquote AGI, which is a very pointless term at this point. But they
Okay.
work in a world with many powerful AIs out there in various forms.
All right, I appreciate that. Thanks for the clarification. And then my next question uh is I was curious about like the moral graph stuff. Like how often have you seen folks engage with that interface that the chatbot that builds the moral graph? And then is this
Mhm.
like considered an onboarding step when you enter an institution?
Yeah, we haven't really done anything more with it, or we haven't actually pushed for uh, that being used in any particular place yet. I think it's a pretty heavy, like it demands a lot from users. And so on its own, I don't think it's the solution necessarily to like some of these things. I could imagine a kind of a version of that, which is sort of like a little bit more in the harbor multi kind of directions, kind of why I put them there side by side, in the sense that I do think there's several ways in which kind of like democratic sort of mechanisms will fail. One is sort of like speed based, in the sense that any kind of like regulation, especially sort of democratically legitimated regulation, is just way too slow and will kind of be outpaced by AI corporations finding loopholes in the law, and there's no way for people to oversee that, for instance. Um, and another way they will fail, I think, is this sort of like shallowness and brittleness of preferences, where it's very easy overall to sway public opinion in on the level of preferences. And I think that will just become even more the case in the more kind of like we get into AI, where you can manipulate through various kinds of effective means. And I guess our case is that values are more robust to this, or the way we think about values it is gives us kind of a robustness that you don't get with the preference level. And so, and you sort of get to this level in real person deliberation too, where you sort of get to explain the whys behind your statements. And then when you get to that level, you find that there's often way more convergence than on the level of preferences, which is very brittle and easy to co-opt.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The values and morals are a lot harder to change than preferences. But yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Sure.
Steve?
You're muted, Steve.
There you go.
There you go.
So, yeah, regarding all of this values and preferences thing, I mean, I use the term professed preferences to be sort of like the preferences that you'll stand behind. So I use the word that very much as you use the term values, I think.
Mhm.
I am the head of policy at Quai.ai, and
Mhm.
um, I have some sort of big theses about this in the society that must emerge if we're going to have anything like democracy. I think democracy is going to essentially be equivalent to equitable distribution of compute, um, and self-sovereign compute at that, that will have personal agents that are loyal to us in a very thick way. You know, in other words, they'll have
Mhm.
specified duties to us that are trained into them and then are put into their prompts and then are in their knowledge bases and yada, yada, yada. So I see this
Mhm.
value card you have as more of sort of a RAG knowledge base that will guide the behavior of these personal agents, and that they can also share with other people or other agents in the society and be like, this is what I'm committed to. And you can even look at my code. And I would say eventually we're going to have very, very high transparency between agents that mutually trust each other. So, like humans reveal more and more of their details over time to each other, that will happen with agents as well. And so I see less of a need for institutions in the future, if that makes sense, and more dynamic groups. We're working at the Trust over IP uh, organization, a foundation
Mhm.
rather, to essentially create these things called verifiable trust communities, which are these sort of portable trust networks that you can use to establish actual communities from as a skeleton and reinstantiate things. Someone joins your community you don't want, you just reform a different community without them,
Mhm.
or whatever, but um, yeah. So that's just sort
Yeah,
of random thoughts.
interesting. I guess I see where you're getting at. I would challenge it a little bit though. I mean, like there's like I guess democracy with humans used to be more sort of like you had all these like meso layers where you kind of like smaller town halls meetings and sort of
Yeah, I
associations and stuff
actually
like
have
that.
a paper called Cascading Councils that is exactly
Yeah.
that. So you're intuiting the right thing.
And I guess the, now we've sort of moved towards more just like mass voting. And I think that's kind of a mistake. Like we lose a lot by doing that. And there is a similar line of thought in markets also, or like some people think of markets as just like free individuals. And then there is like, do you market as the coordination mechanisms? Or I
Well,
guess I
I
just
just
see
read
it as
your
there's like,
cosine paper. I would call that cosine
all right,
collapse more than compression. But
sure. Yeah.
yeah, I think reputation markets are the future. I think that financial markets are going to become secondary to reputation markets. That's my main
Could be,
concern.
but I mean, I guess like I think the same thing. I guess what I would say, which is like I think the same thing roughly holds in that world with AI agents too, where like there needs to be at some point there needs to be some
Yeah,
decision
well,
made.
that's
So
what I
even
mean.
if
That's all the same thing. I'm talking about, between people, between agents, it's all going to be reputation.
oh no, but I was going to say that it's all there's going to be some sort of need for some kind of institution for the agents too. No, like even if they very well like represent our exact beliefs and they are able to have a rich sort of space of options and actions for themselves, they need to somehow figure out how to trade
Yeah,
off
yeah,
our
no, there'll be all
beliefs or
sorts
our
of group
values.
identities because you need to, if you're a member of a group, then you can borrow the reputation of that group for a third party that doesn't know you and things like that. So there are levels of aggregation above the individual agents or people. I'm just saying that they need to be more dynamic.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I'm totally with you on that though. Like I could imagine many sort of like many versions. I mean, this grid might seem like a little static in that sense that like, oh, there is this like cell to fill out. And I'm totally with you that like it's obviously more complex than that. And some of them might be kind of emergent or sort of coming out of the agents themselves. Like I think the agents already created a religion for themselves. No one ever saw that, that's just gonna happen. Um so I can see that, but I do still think that there will definitely be this meta layer in society, and I think there's a bunch of challenges to figure out beforehand how that will work.
And there's all sorts of things like registries and so on and so forth. Are you familiar with Project Nanda at MIT?
Projects. Nope.
NANDA, which is one of the things that they're doing is they're trying to create a distributed, agent system registry. So you can have various components of your agent systems discoverable with their various certifications and blah, 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 blah. So, but to
Cool.
do it not in a way like DNS, where everything would bottleneck through one thing, and to be able to have it very responsive in real time. So if an agent goes rogue, people can transmit that information very quickly over the network and things like that. So they got a lot of
Mhm.
good ideas over there.
Cool. I'll check it out.
Brett, go for it.
Hey there. So a little outside of my space. So anyway, I think I followed most of it. What you guys were just talking about is kind of like intriguing, but it kind of like I was listening more to you and Steve go back and forth and trying to like put those pieces together, and I kind of lost my train of thought what I was going to ask. But I had a couple thoughts basically. Um, One is the G necessary? In other words, and I think you kind of answered this earlier. Like we don't really need AGI for any of this, right? It's just AI, right? Sophisticated AI agents or supposedly smart software agents that are doing things,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
AGI is kind of like it can mean so many different things at this point. Like some people mean all cognitive tasks. Well, what's that? It's possible to define. Some people say all economically valuable labor. That's
Yeah.
also kind of impossible to define and
I
shifts
I
all the
just
time.
see it to me. I see AGI, and my instinct right away is to be dismissive of everything that then comes thereafter because I think
Yeah.
there's
No, I
so
mean,
much
and
hype and
that,
BS about AGI that it's distracting from the more meaningful things, which are all of the various supposedly smart software agents that we are currently building and deploying that aren't even remotely close to the
yeah.
AGI, like, so to me, when I saw it, I'm like, oh, it's AGI. I will, in a sense, wasn't going to attend. I just opened up the chart, was like looking at your stuff. I was like, nah. But then I looked at it, and I was like, I don't think any of this actually has to do with AGI at all, or it's not dependent on AGI. It's really just about, I think, it just seems like all of the observations you're making apply if we're talking about, moderately smart software agents that are
Yeah. I
that
mean,
are
I think
capable of performing certain functions autonomously without immediate direct control of a human user. And then there's tons of that stuff happening all the time already. And the question is
mhm.
sort of like, what are the governance institutions and mechanisms? Right? So if that's right, let me throw out just a
Mhm.
couple of ideas about that I don't know where they fit in the charts exactly, but I'll tell you, they matter a lot in the offline world and in our existing human institutional world, and they ought to surface in this world that you're imagining. So one is things like and I've written a ton of like things like friction in design or traffic calming measures, right? So like speed bumps on roads, right? So one of the
Hmm.
things about, yeah, humans are slow and inefficient, make all these mistakes, or we have a bunch of assumptions about them. But these AI agents or this basic software is going to do things quicker and fast. So one
Hmm.
thought about governing the relationships that emerge, but also the ones that are predictable, is to slow shit down when it
Hmm.
makes sense to slow things down, right? So you might think about governance seams where you have friction at the constructed interface to enable like
Hmm.
APIs with friction that enables governance itself, right? You could
Yeah.
there's a bunch. I have a paper with Paul Ohm in the Harvard Journal of Law and Tech about governance seams. Like there's a whole set of ideas about frictional interventions. They can be mandated by the law, but they also don't need to be mandated by the law. A lot of times they're just implemented as part of an architectural design. And so I don't know how those fit exactly, but they're into this, but they ought to, and so a lot of us are thinking about this now. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
how ought we think about pro-social friction in a world in which software is performing various functions in the world?
Yeah,
That's
I think that
one.
could be more sort of a kind of a tool to use while constructing many of these. Makes sense.
The other thought is it was just a call, just doing something this morning with, the GPC, like the global privacy control.
GPC.
Um,
No, I don't.
okay, it's not about software agents in particular. It's about, it's basically a privacy control where you can express your preference about, uh, it's like a do not track signal, except GPC signals are legally enforceable in like 22 states in the United States. And so there's sort of an architectural signal of a preference about privacy, about collection and use of personal information. And then there's a legal, it's sufficiently standardized and uniform that it's now legally enforceable in a bunch of states and it's sort of spreading, right? So the thought I had when you were sort of talking about preferences is, and one of the things we're working on is extending GPC-like signals. Like, what's the kind of preference signaling mechanism you might want to have with respect to AI agents, right? So if we assume that for most agents, there's a human principle, maybe you
Hmm.
don't think that. Maybe we don't think there are going to be human principles, but that's another institutional thing we might want to be talking about is like, when and how do we have laws that require human principles to be able to exercise some degree of control and be responsible or accountable for agents' actions in the world, right? So principal agent law does that in a variety of different ways. The question is how to extend that to these software agents. Um, and if there
Hmm.
are human principles, at least for many of these agents, right, the question is how do they express your preferences about what an agent's going to
Hmm.
do, right? So the agents have tons of autonomy and freedom to operate in the world, just like I'm a lawyer, or I was a lawyer.
Hmm.
I mean, as a lawyer and I have a client, the client exercises control as the principal over what I do, but at the same time, my day-to-day operations, I have an incredible amount of autonomy, right? I write what I want to write, I say in
Yeah.
court what I want to say. They don't control they don't micromanage my behavior, but they have a certain degree of control. So my
Yeah.
question when I'm thinking about a lot of these about intelligent software agents is in the world, whether they're AGI or not, is how are human principles going to be able to exercise express their preferences about the range and scope of behaviors without micromanaging, so there's still autonomy, and at the same
Hmm.
time, how do we hold them legally accountable when agents don't necessarily conform to the the range of preferences? In other words, it's like when a lawyer doesn't actually do what's in the client's interest, for example, right? How
Yeah.
do we
Yeah.
hold them accountable? Well, what are we going to do? And so I'm just wondering, like, what I'm thinking fits in with this mapping because I think there's overlaps, but I didn't quite pick it
Yeah,
out.
yeah, totally. I think there's definitely, I think this principal agent sort of question comes up in a lot of these. And so it's not like necessarily one box, but more like a component of many boxes. Like AI, I mean, there's AI judges in there like that. So that's one of them. And it's something where yeah, we have a lawyer actually, another legal scholar in our network who is writing a piece for a publication we're planning to start around this field of AGI institutions, which is exactly on this question of like delegation and what that means and sort of these principal agent problems. in this world. So it's like you're thinking about entirely the right things. Um, and and I think both of the things you mentioned are show up as kind of like problems in designing many of these. They're not necessarily one box. Um,
That makes sense. Sorry, I didn't really ask a question too. I just rambled a whole series of comments.
Matters.
Liz, you have your hand up.
Oh, yes. I wanted to thank Oliver so much for coming in. I've been a fan of Oliver's
First,
work since I met the Meaning Alignment Project through the Interoperable Deliberative Tools cohort last year. And sidebar, I would still love to use Moral Graph, Oliver. I don't know if there's like can I like use
yeah,
it?
you can. I guess there is it's a little embarrassing. We haven't. I guess we're having just a little too many things to do, so we don't have quite the resource ourselves to make it into a standalone good thing. There is a hosted version of it. I haven't looked at it in a long time, so I don't know how yeah what the state is, but we have that. Um,
Okay. Maybe I could just follow
yeah,
up with you about like, hey, can you like let me log in and like run a process with some people and check it out?
yeah. Yeah, I'll give it a check and see what the state is. Um, where's the? Oh, sorry, I was reading the chat wrong.
I'd
Um,
Um,
love to learn more about moral graph because that caught my eye as well. Um, but I don't think you really
yeah,
dove into exactly what it is.
I
Is
can
it a
sh
tool you built or?
I can share a little more about it. I guess this might be like a little repetition for some, but happy to.
and
I
then
I
I
can
do.
share this potentially. So we did this experiment with OpenAI. They gave us some money during this like democratic input process where we built this system that interviews people about tricky topics that are kind of like contentious in American politics. And one of them was around abortion. And so um, the one question that some people came to ChatGPT was something like, "I'm a Christian girl, I'm considering abortion. What should I do?" And so we did this process with represented several Americans. Some of them were Republicans, some of them were Democrats. And the process is essentially these two steps. Like there's one values interview, which is a kind of a chat that you go through. I have to log in for this now so I can show it to you. But it's essentially a 10-minute LLM chat where it drills down into sort of like what are the sort of reasons behind your preferences or your slogans, or like why are you pro-choice or pro-life or whatever, like what's behind that. And what you get to is this thing we call values cards, and they are things like this where they say something about where to pay attention to in certain situations. Um, And so, if you're assisting the girl with her religious beliefs, then there are certain ways of doing that. And so we're quite specific with what we mean with the context. And then we can kind of look at exactly at like what this person think is wise to pay attention to, or like what exactly do they consider when they're making a choice in how to assist the girl with her religious beliefs, for instance. Um, and then this second step, where it gets a little complicated, is these sort of edges which link these values together. And so here you have a bunch of sort of mini graphs that are split up based on a topic area. It might be actually more helpful to show this thing instead, which is kind of a graph of all the values and all the edges. And so if we look, for instance, at an edge here, you have one value which is about like, and I think this is about when seeking clarity or something like that. Yeah. So like, if the girl is confused, for instance, is it wiser to try to show her a lot of diverse viewpoints and give her many perspectives, or to help her articulate her understanding? We collect these by showing these values pairwise and then having a generated story about someone moving from one value to the other. And then we asking participants, do you think this person became wiser by doing this move? Like they used to thought that the right approach here was to consider many diverse viewpoints, and then something happened, and now they think it's better to actually help her articulate her understanding together. And if a majority agree that the directionality is one way and not the other, then we draw that as a graph, or as an edge in this graph. Um, and this is kind of cool because it means you can sort of map out where people think the moral can kind of map out the moral learning of this collective, like what do people think is wiser than other things. And then you can also use things like PageRank and graph algorithms to try to find the wisest values where people feel like they're represented, like it feels like it's legitimate because my value counted in a certain way. But we did not like vote on that value. Like it's part of a chain leading up to a certain thing, which you then can feel a sort of an affinity for. And that's what we saw empirically also, where a lot of people were like totally on board with the resulting outcome, even though their value did not necessarily win, but it was part of a branch leading up to, for instance, this value, which is kind of like the one that won for the abortion case. See, it's kind of like the bluest one. The blueness here represents the sort of quote unquote wisdom score, like the PageRank score leading up to the winning one. And this one is also articulated by a Christian girl who had an abortion when she was young. And so that's a kind of way to you could make a case that that's sort of like a kind of a relevant moral expertise for the question at hand. Like she had a certain kind of life experience that gives her uh, um, some should arguably give her some more weight in her say, and that sort of just fizzled up when you run with this process. I mean, compare that to just voting, and then it was just drowned out by the majority. Um, so that's a little bit more about that. This other page that I showed you also has another step where we try to generate policies based on the winning values for each of these contexts. And I think it's cool because many of them surface policy solutions which are kind of like not really in the zeitgeist or sort of like kind of win-win in a certain way, where, for instance, like assisting girls in reflecting on her values. An intervention that was suggested here, generated by another LLM by looking at the winning value, was that the government should establish these nationwide confidential mentorship programs. And that's something that kind of, you see both like Republicans and Democrats kind of all come together around this thing. And that's a very different debate to have. Like if you look at the kind of winning value here and what it means to help someone with self-reflection, and you end up with this policy instead that kind of helps the girl to self-respect or self-introspect in that way. It's just like an entirely different policy debate to have than the one we currently have, which I think is kind of what the big unlock here. If you can kind of go to the values level, surface what people think is wise, you can see that kind of, Republicans, Democrats come together in doing that, and it also leads to sort of new win-win policy solutions. I think it's kind of cool. All right, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Liz, you had another question?
Yes, I just couldn't resist calling back to Moral Graph, but I did have a question about the current work. I just wanted to mention another Metagov research director. I don't know if Evan Miyazono might have crossed your radar, Oliver, but I wanted to provide you a couple links and then let me know later if you'd like to talk. So Atlas Computing um, they've been fiscally sponsored by Metagov for a couple of years, and now they're graduating and they're joining convergentresearch.org, which is quite a big foundation, and they set up focused research organizations with large amounts of money.
Mhm.
And Evan's work is on, he calls it civilizational backlog, but it kind of
Mhm.
seems like the AGI institutional gap map that you have as well. So, I just wanted to put this out there. If you see that there's overlap and alignment, I'll check with Evan as well and would be happy to connect you.
Yeah, I guess most likely we are very much in need of more research and more help. I'll just go back to the grid again, just to show you that also in this grid, I guess at the bottom there is this methods column where essentially we kind of try to map out what are the expertise that's actually needed to make good solutions here. And so our role in all of this is to be more of a coordinator. We're not necessarily doing that much in-house anymore. We did these point efforts that I show you over the market intermediaries and the moral graph stuff, but um, most of what we do is actually try to bring together the kind of expertise we think is needed to make this happen. So for instance, for the sort of norms column, you have kind of things around models of norm learning that are important to know about. For the preferences column, you have generative social choice and auction design and mechanism design and these kind of things. And so uh, that's just to say that yeah, we're definitely in need of finding more researchers who are working on parts of this piece, and that's kind of a little bit what we're looking for. I don't know exactly where Evan would slot in, but
Now
I'll
there's
check
a
him out.
little bit of overlap, say for between norms and incentives. For example, I would say in a well-functioning society, there's a norm that you expect to understand other people's incentives,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, no,
So like,
they're not necessarily cleanly
right,
split. I
yeah,
think
yeah, yeah,
there's
okay.
many ways
All
in
right.
which they're
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But like I said, I have
um,
my question here too, which is how do I get involved in this process and in trying to, fill in the boxes, as it were.
yeah, and the boxes you can actually start filling in today by going to the oh yeah, I don't think I actually linked it in the chat. AGI-institutions.org. Um, we are it's all sort of backed up on GitHub through a kind of open repository. So there's although we haven't been very good at specifying exactly what we're looking for here, but like the goal is to make it a sort of a joint thing where the more we can draw from different
Yeah,
disciplines and have other people
yeah.
think about problem sets and things like that, the better. Um, yeah, and then I guess if you want to get more involved, then shoot us an email.
Well, I did shoot you 2 emails in February, so that's why I'm asking about other stuff.
Uh,
Or rather, I'd research at Meaning Alignment Institute. Anyway,
yeah, sorry if we never got back to you. It might have
yeah, it
slipped through the
happens.
cracks, but yeah, research at meaningalignment.org is the one.
Okay.
If nobody else has another question, if you do, feel free to send them in chat. But I do have a question myself about like I'm really inspired by the kind of yeah, surfacing of these like off the beaten path or just yeah, alternative like policy proposals as like a interesting kind of outcome. Like here's where there was alignment and this type of response is like not outlandish and but just like not on your radar or something. And I feel like there's like yeah, I guess d- um maybe that's more for moral graph projects. Definitely want to learn more and get involved, but I'm curious like how you're like how these different tools piece together. You said that you're focusing on um, kind of yeah, well, from what I understand, you're focusing on coordination, but are you running these experiments still? Are you running pilots? Are you trying to identify these different like policy solutions? Or are you looking for groups to do that, run those, like, and you're working on kind of identifying those groups?
Um, yeah, we're doing less and less research in-house is the short answer, and more of like uh, trying to almost like pair together almost like teams. Or we're raising money now to essentially commission a lot of researchers in our network to help them kind of get going with some of these challenges. Um, yeah, sorry, I kind of lost the rest of the question a little bit, but we've done some, kind of pointed research for some of these boxes, but there is for every box, I think there's like several stages that need to happen. There is kind of like, the initial sort of theoretical research, but then some sort of like prototype, a little bit what we did with Moral Graph with this representative American audience. But then after that, there is also kind of broader legitimation, some large scale test of it. And then maybe even after that, it could be folded into policy or run by a big organization. And so there's like another dimension of the grid, which is kind of like the steps towards widespread deployment. So there's just like a lot of stuff to do. And our role is kind of increasingly becoming kind of a convener, commissioner, and sort of and router rather than uh, doing a lot of this in-house because we don't really have the resources for it.
Nice. Yeah. Um, I feel like Metagov is kind of operating in a similar way with sort of research areas and um, different working groups. But uh, yeah, I don't know. It's just interesting to also pair that with like different tools. I don't know. Any other questions from folks here? I see some stuff in the chat.
I mean, I don't have a question really, just more of a comment too. Like, I think it's super interesting. Like I said before, the mapping is useful generally, like to just sort of see how people like the way that you guys have broken down a bunch of things. Um, what's interesting about these was I think what's come up, a few different people have said similar things. It's like there's a bunch of people at Metagov who are doing similar things. And it just reminds me of the friction and design stuff. There's like a dozen different ways to talk about friction and design. That's like my coin of term is like friction in design, but there's seamful design, there's frictionless this, there's a million ways. And one of the struggles is always figuring out how to find bring everyone together, have a community of people who are doing it so that you're not sort of basically everyone's reinventing the same wheel over and over again in separate little spaces. And I have this like sneaky suspicion that what you're doing is super useful, and it's like super useful in a way that like a bunch of other groups are doing similarly super useful things that are like completely overlapping and maybe using different terminology and approaches. And so this is not a criticism. It's literally the same thing I face
No,
in
no, no.
like,
You're entirely right. Many of the, I guess that's kind of like the felt sense from a lot of these researchers we talk to who are kind of like in one of these fields. Like a lot of academics are like very focused on like their thing, and then they
yeah,
know AI is a thing, and so they should probably do like AI and law something something, but they don't quite see how it sort of fits into the grander picture. And it's like sometimes very useful to be like, all right, yeah, right. There is this kind of like rethinking of quote unquote society essentially that sort of has to happen, and there is a way in which I fit into it, and there is other disciplines that I should work with to make all of this go well. Um, yeah.
yeah. Which is half the fun of it really, is sort of being able to make those connections really. So it's good. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Oliver. I'm definitely interest peaked and wanna if you do end up, or if there is a way that we can test or do a round on moral graph, or yeah, continue to support your work in any way, just let us know. But yeah, I'm eager to dive even deeper into the research now. So thank you for your presentation. Thanks everyone for coming, and see you next week at our next Metagov seminar.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
But
Bye-bye.